Derek Mitchell stood in the pouring rain, his government contract notification still glowing on his phone. $100 billion, the biggest defense technology deal in American history. But the locks on his own front door had just been changed. Through the rain-streaked windows of the house he'd paid for, he could see his wife Victoria hanging birthday balloons, her lover Ryan Caldwell laughing as she fed him cake in Derek's kitchen, completely unaware that the man they'd just locked out had become one of the most powerful contractors in the nation. Derek had won a $100 billion government contract just 3 hours ago, a victory that would reshape his entire existence. But his wife had locked him out of their house to host her lover's birthday party, believing he was still the struggling engineer she'd grown to despise. The government contract papers in his briefcase were worth more than every house on their street combined. Yet here he stood, drenched and devastated, watching the woman he'd built everything for celebrate another man. What Derek did next would shock her in ways she never imagined. But would she even recognize the magnitude of what she'd thrown away when she locked him out? And when the truth about that government contract finally reached her, would the $100 billion victory feel like justice, or just another reminder of everything that had crumbled between them? Derek's fingers trembled as he stared at the changed locks, water streaming down his face mixing with something that might have been tears. The email from the Department of Defense still blazed on his phone screen. "Congratulations, Mr. Mitchell. Your proposal for the Quantum Defense Shield Initiative has been selected. Contract value, $100,000. $100 billion. The number seemed absurd, impossible, a string of zeros that would have made him laugh if his chest didn't feel like it was caving in. He'd left the Pentagon briefing room 3 hours ago in a daze, his mind spinning with the implications. 12 years of 18-hour days, of missing dinners and anniversaries, of Victoria's increasingly cold silences. It had all led to this moment. The quantum encryption breakthrough he'd developed in their garage, the same garage Victoria complained smelled like burnt circuits and broken dreams, was now classified as essential to national security. 4-star generals had shaken his hand. The Secretary of Defense had personally congratulated him. He was going to be rich beyond imagination, powerful beyond measure. But he'd wanted to tell Victoria first, before the news broke, before the media circus began. He'd driven home rehearsing the words, imagining her face lighting up, the way she'd used to look at him when they were both grad students, sharing ramen in his dorm room. He'd stopped at the jeweler on King Street and bought the emerald necklace she'd admired 6 months ago, the one she'd sighed over before walking away because it cost $3,000. Pocket change now. Everything was about to change. Then he'd pulled into their driveway and seen Ryan Caldwell's Tesla. Again. Derek had known about Ryan for 6 weeks. He'd found the text while Victoria was in the shower, her phone lighting up with messages that made his stomach twist. Ryan Caldwell, the wealth management advisor with the perfect smile and the trust fund inheritance. Ryan, who took Victoria to restaurants Derek couldn't afford, who bought her gifts that made Derek's anniversary presents look pathetic. Ryan, who didn't work 80-hour weeks or come home smelling like soldering flux. He'd confronted Victoria 3 weeks ago. She'd laughed, actually laughed, and told him he was paranoid. "You're so obsessed with your little project that you're seeing things that aren't there," she'd said, her eyes cold. "Maybe if you paid half as much attention to me as you do to your circuits, we wouldn't be having problems." Derek had wanted to believe her. God, how he'd wanted to believe her. So he'd thrown himself even harder into the final push for the contract presentation, telling himself that once he succeeded, once he could give her the life she deserved, everything would be okay. Now he stood at his own front door, and through the bay window he could see Victoria's lie in vivid detail. 20 people filled their living room, balloons in silver and black, a birthday banner that read, "Happy 35th, Ryan." Victoria wore the red dress Derek had bought her for their last anniversary, the one she'd never worn for him. She was laughing, her head thrown back in a way Derek hadn't seen in years, as Ryan opened presents on Derek's couch. Derek tried his key. It didn't work. He tried again, jiggling it, but the locks had been changed. His own house, the house where he'd refinanced twice to fund his research, where he'd mortgaged their future on the belief that his breakthrough would come. Victoria had locked him out. He knocked, then pounded. Through the window, he saw Victoria glance toward the door, saw her say something to Ryan, saw them both laugh. She knew he was out there. She didn't care. Derek's phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer, James Thornton. CNN just called me. Story breaks in 90 minutes. You need to prepare a statement. This is going to be massive. Congratulations, Derek. You just became one of the most important people in America. 90 minutes. In 90 minutes, Victoria would see his face on every news channel, would hear about the $100 billion contract, would realize exactly what she'd just done. But Derek didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. He walked back to his car, his government contract briefcase in hand, and sat in the driver's seat watching water cascade down the windshield. His entire life had been building toward this moment. But the woman he'd built it for was inside celebrating another man's birthday, wearing another man's gifts, living the life Derek had killed himself to provide. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Victoria, 7 years ago on their wedding day, whispering in his ear as they danced. I don't care if we're poor, Derek. I just want you to be happy. I just want us. He'd believed her then. They'd lived in a one-bedroom apartment, eaten grocery store sushi, and been ridiculously happy. When had that changed? When had the love curdle into resentment, the partnership into contempt? Derek knew the answer. It had changed when Victoria's high school friends started getting successful, when her sister married a cardiologist, when every social media post showed someone else's vacation, someone else's new car, someone else's perfect life. Victoria had started looking at Derek differently then, started making comments about his hobby project, started asking when he was going to get a real job at Google or Microsoft instead of chasing his fantasy. He tried to explain that what he was building was revolutionary, that the quantum encryption could change everything. But Victoria had stopped listening. She'd started staying late at the gym, started taking girls' trips that lasted entire weekends, started mentioning Ryan Caldwell's name with increasing frequency. Ryan says, Ryan thinks, Ryan invited us to, until Derek wanted to scream. Now his phone exploded with notifications, texts from colleagues, emails from investors, missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. The news was spreading faster than expected. His lawyer called. Derek, where are you? We need to get you somewhere safe. The media is going to descend in. Derek, are you listening? I'm at my house, Derek said quietly. My wife locked me out. Silence on the other end. Then, she what? She changed the locks. She's throwing a birthday party for her boyfriend. Inside my house. Derek. James's voice was very careful. You just became worth more than some small countries. You need to get somewhere secure, and you need to think very carefully about your next move. Do you understand what I'm saying? Derek understood. The government contract came with stock options in his company, Titan Tech Industries, which would go public within 6 months. His personal shares alone would be worth approximately $14 billion. He'd signed a prenuptial agreement when he and Victoria married, back when he had nothing and she'd thought it was romantic, a gesture of faith. That prenup protected everything he'd built, everything he'd created. Victoria was entitled to the house, to half of his current salary, to alimony. She wasn't entitled to Titan Tech, to the government contract, to the fortune that was about to materialize. But she didn't know that yet. She thought she was locked into a marriage with a failure, a dreamer who'd wasted their best years chasing an impossible goal. That's why she'd grown so brazen with Ryan, why she'd stopped pretending, why she'd locked Derek out of his own house tonight. She thought she had nothing to lose. Through the rain, Derek saw the front door open. Ryan Caldwell stepped onto the porch, his phone to his ear, his face confused. He looked at his phone, then up at the sky, then directly at Derek's car. Even from 40 feet away, Derek could see Ryan's expression change, see the recognition dawn. Ryan had seen the news. Victoria appeared behind Ryan, wrapped in his arms, laughing at something. Then she looked at Ryan's phone. Derek watched her face drain of color, watched her push away from Ryan, watched her stare at the phone screen with her hand over her mouth. She looked up, searching the street, and her eyes locked on Derek's car. Derek started the engine. His lawyer was still talking, saying something about crisis management and media strategy, but Derek wasn't listening anymore. He put the car in reverse, pulled out of the driveway, and drove away from the house where his marriage had died. away from the woman who'd locked him out on the night he'd won everything. His phone rang. Victoria. He declined the call. It rang again immediately. Again. The texts started flooding in. Derek, where are you? Derek, please call me. Derek, I can explain. Derek, I made a mistake. Derek, please come home. Come home. To the house where she'd celebrated another man's birthday while Derek stood in the rain. To the woman who'd laughed when he knocked. To the life that had become a prison of resentment and contempt. Derek drove to the Marriott downtown and checked into a suite under his lawyer's name. Within an hour, James arrived with a crisis management team, a security detail, and a bottle of very expensive scotch. Within 2 hours, Derek's face was on every major news network. Defense tech visionary wins historic 100B contract. Quantum breakthrough secures national defense. Meet Derek Mitchell, the engineer who just changed everything. His phone never stopped ringing. Victoria called 63 times that night. Derek didn't answer once. The morning sun through the hotel windows felt like an accusation. Derek hadn't slept, had spent the night watching news coverage of himself, while his phone vibrated with hundreds of messages he couldn't bring himself to read. His face was everywhere. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, even international channels. The Department of Defense had confirmed the contract at dawn, and now the speculation had begun about Titan Tech's inevitable IPO, about Derek's net worth, about what this meant for American defense. James arrived at 7 with coffee and a grim expression. We need to talk about Victoria. Derek's hands tightened around his cup. What about her? She's hired Martin Kessler. James's voice was flat. Martin Kessler was the most vicious divorce attorney in 3 states, famous for destroying prenuptial agreements and extracting maximum settlements. She filed this morning. She's claiming the prenup is invalid because you coerced her into signing it, that Titan Tech was a marital asset developed during your marriage, and that she's entitled to half of everything, including the government contract proceeds. Derek laughed, a sound with no humor in it. She locked me out of my own house last night while she threw a party for her boyfriend. We have texts, we have evidence of her affair, and she's claiming I coerced her? She's claiming you emotionally abandoned her, that your obsession with work destroyed your marriage, that she was driven into another man's arms by your neglect. James pulled out his tablet and showed Derek a statement Victoria had released to the media. She's playing the victim. Look. Derek read Victoria's carefully crafted statement, each word a knife. She painted herself as the supportive wife who'd sacrificed her own career, who'd stood by Derek through years of failure, who'd believed in him when no one else did. She claimed she'd taken a second mortgage on their house to fund his research, that she'd worked 2 jobs to support his dream. All lies, or at least carefully selected truths, twisted beyond recognition. The second mortgage was my decision, Derek said. She fought me on it. And she worked as a yoga instructor for 6 months before deciding it was beneath her. I know, but she's good at this, Derek. She's already giving interviews, crying on camera, talking about how she gave up everything for your dream, and now you're abandoning her at your moment of triumph. James paused. The public loves her. They think you're a heartless tech bro who got rich and dumped his loyal wife. Derek's phone buzzed with a news alert. Tech billionaire, Derek Mitchell's wife, breaks silence. I gave him everything. The photo showed Victoria, eyes red, looking devastated. No mention of Ryan Caldwell. No mention of the locked door, the changed locks, the birthday party for her lover. We need to destroy her, Derek said quietly. We need to show everyone what she really is. James shook his head. That's what she wants. She wants you angry, wants you to make mistakes. Martin Kessler's entire strategy depends on painting you as the villain. If you attack her publicly, you prove her narrative. He leaned forward. But if you stay calm, if you let the evidence speak for itself, if you show the world you're the bigger person, that's how we win. Win, Derek repeated. What does winning even look like anymore? Winning looks like protecting what you built. Winning looks like making sure she doesn't get a penny of Titan Tech, doesn't touch the government contract money, doesn't profit from the company you bled for. James's voice hardened. Winning looks like walking away from this divorce with your empire intact while she realizes exactly what she threw away when she locked that door. Derek thought about Victoria's face through the window, the way she'd laughed while he stood in the rain. He thought about Ryan Caldwell's arms around her, about the birthday banner, about the red dress she'd never worn for him. He thought about 12 years of marriage, of promises made and broken, of love that had curdled into something unrecognizable. "What do we do?" he asked. James smiled. "We build the case. We document everything. The affair, the texts, the financial records showing she didn't contribute what she claims. We show the prenup was signed freely, that she had her own lawyer, that she understood exactly what she was signing, and we wait for her to make mistakes because she will. Martin Kessler's clients always do." Over the next 3 weeks, Derek watched his life become a media circus. Victoria gave tearful interviews where she claimed Derek had changed, had become obsessed with money and power, had pushed her away. She wore simple clothes in these interviews, no makeup, playing the role of the wounded wife perfectly. The comment sections were vicious. Gold digger got what she deserved. Poor woman gave him everything. Men always leave when they get successful. The public couldn't decide if Victoria was a saint or a villain, and the ambiguity kept the story alive. What the public didn't see were the private investigators James had hired. They documented everything. Ryan Caldwell's visits to Derek's house, the hotel rooms Victoria and Ryan had shared, the expensive gifts Ryan had bought her with money Derek had earned. They found text messages Victoria had deleted, emails she'd thought were gone forever, evidence of an affair that had lasted not 6 weeks, but nearly 2 years. Derek also didn't see that evidence immediately shared with the public. James was right. Releasing it now would look vindictive, would play into Victoria's narrative of the heartless husband. So they waited, and they built the case, and they let Victoria think she was winning. Meanwhile, Derek's company exploded. Titan Tech's valuation skyrocketed as details of the quantum defense system emerged. Major tech companies wanted to partner. Venture capitalists begged for investment opportunities. Foreign governments inquired about licensing the technology. Derek found himself in meetings with people who'd seemed unreachable just months ago, found himself making decisions that would affect thousands of jobs, millions of lives. But at night, alone in his hotel suite, he felt empty. The victory tasted like ash. He'd won everything and lost the only person he'd wanted to share it with. Except he'd lost her long before the government contract, long before the locked door. Maybe he'd lost her years ago, when work consumed him, when dinner conversations became status reports, when he'd stopped noticing the distance growing between them. His mother called from Florida, her voice tight with worry. "Derek, honey, I saw Victoria on the news. She's saying terrible things." "I know, Mom. But they're not true, are they? You didn't abandon her. You were working to build something." "I worked all the time," Derek admitted. "I missed anniversaries. I forgot birthdays. I was so focused on the breakthrough that I stopped seeing her." "That doesn't excuse what she did. Locking you out, the affair, no, it doesn't excuse it. But maybe I drove her to it. Maybe if I'd paid attention." "Derek Anthony Mitchell," his mother's voice turned sharp, "don't you dare blame yourself for her choices. You worked hard, yes. You pursued your dream, yes. But you were faithful. You were honest. You were trying to build a future for both of you. She gave up and found someone else. That's on her." Derek wanted to believe that. Some days he did. Other days he wondered if Victoria's version was closer to the truth, if he'd been so blinded by his obsession with quantum encryption that he'd failed to see his marriage crumbling until it was too late. The deposition was scheduled for week 5. Derek sat across from Victoria for the first time since the night of the locked door, and the woman facing him was a stranger. She wore a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back, her expression carefully neutral. Martin Kessler sat beside her like a guard dog, ready to attack. James started gently, establishing timeline, asking about the early years of the marriage. Victoria described their courtship, their wedding, the happy times before Derek changed. She was good at this, Derek realized. She'd always been good at telling stories, at making people believe her version of events. Then James pulled out the first text message, printed and highlighted. A message from Victoria to Ryan Caldwell, dated 18 months ago. "He's so wrapped up in his stupid project that he doesn't even notice when I'm gone. I could leave for a week and he'd probably just order more takeout. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. I was venting. Every wife vents. James pulled out another. I can't wait until this house sells so I can finally be free of him. 2 more years and I'm gone, with or without his precious quantum whatever. When was your house listed for sale? James asked mildly. It wasn't, Victoria admitted. It was just talk. The messages kept coming, each one more damning than the last. Plans to leave Derek as soon as his company had any value. Discussions with Ryan about how to maximize a divorce settlement. Calculations of what Victoria thought she was owed. And through it all, contempt for Derek's work, mockery of his dreams, certainty that he would fail. Did you believe in your husband's work, Mrs. Mitchell? James asked. Victoria's lawyer objected, but Victoria answered anyway. I believed in him. I just thought he should be practical, should take a stable job instead of chasing fantasies. Fantasies that resulted in a $100 billion government contract. I didn't know that would happen. No one did. But you knew he was presenting to the Department of Defense. He told you about the final briefing, didn't he? Victoria hesitated. Yes. And what did you do that day? Silence. Mrs. Mitchell, what did you do on the day your husband presented his quantum defense system to the Pentagon? The day he won the largest defense contract in American history? Victoria's face went red. I had plans. You changed the locks on your house and threw a birthday party for your boyfriend, James said, his voice still mild. While your husband stood outside in the rain, holding the government contract that would make him a billionaire, you were inside celebrating another man, is that correct? Martin Kessler erupted with objections, but the damage was done. The court reporter had captured Victoria's expression, the way she'd crumbled, the truth written across her face. The deposition continued for 6 hours, and by the end, Victoria's case had disintegrated. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad. She'd had independent counsel, had signed freely, had understood the terms. Her claims of financial contribution evaporated under scrutiny. The affair was documented beyond any denial, but Derek felt no triumph as he left the conference room. He felt tired, used up, like the last 12 years had been a beautiful lie that had rotted from the inside. The settlement conference happened 2 months after the deposition. Victoria looked different, thinner, harder. The mask of the wounded wife finally dropped. Martin Kessler had withdrawn from the case after the deposition disaster, and Victoria's new lawyer looked young and overwhelmed. James laid out Derek's offer, the house fully paid off, alimony for 5 years, a generous amount that would let Victoria live comfortably. Her car, her jewelry, her personal belongings, everything that was fair under the prenuptial agreement in California law. What about Titan Tech? Victoria asked. What about the government contract money? Not yours, James said simply. The prenup is clear. Any company or intellectual property developed by Derek is his separate property. You get nothing from Titan Tech, nothing from the government contract. I supported him while he built that company. You worked as a yoga instructor for 6 months, 12 years ago. Every other expense was covered by Derek's salary from his previous jobs, by loans he took out in his name, by mortgages on property he owned before your marriage. James slid a folder across the table. This is what you're entitled to under the prenup. It's fair, it's generous, and it's final. Victoria stared at the folder like it was a snake. $14 billion, she whispered. The news says he's worth $14 billion, and you're offering me the house in alimony? The house is worth $2 million. The alimony totals $900,000 over 5 years. That's nearly $3 million for 12 years of marriage, most of which you spent planning to leave. James's voice hardened. Or we can go to trial, Mrs. Mitchell. We can put every text message, every hotel receipt, every lie on public record. We can let a judge decide. But I promise you, you'll walk away with less. Victoria's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. Victoria shook her head, then nodded, then pressed her hands to her face. I gave him 12 years, she said. I gave him my 20s and half my 30s. I believed in him when he was nothing. No, Derek said, speaking for the first time. Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. You believed in the version of me that made you feel good about yourself. You believed in struggling artist Derek, who needed you, who made you feel important. But the moment I started succeeding, The moment my dream became real, you hated me for it. You wanted me to fail because my failure made you feel superior. That's not true. You were sleeping with Ryan Caldwell for 2 years, Victoria. 2 years. While I worked 80-hour weeks, while I mortgaged our future, while I killed myself to build something that would give us the life you said you wanted. And when I finally did it, when I finally won, you locked me out of our house to celebrate another man. Derek's voice remained calm, controlled, but Victoria flinched as if he'd shouted, I don't hate you. I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just done. The silence stretched. Finally, Victoria's lawyer cleared his throat. We'll accept the settlement. Victoria signed the papers with shaking hands. As she stood to leave, she looked at Derek one last time. Was it worth it? She asked. Was losing everything worth winning everything? Derek thought about that question for a long time after she left. Was it worth it? The $100 billion, the company, the power, the recognition. Did any of it matter when he came home to an empty hotel suite? When he had no one to share his victories with? When the woman he'd loved had become a stranger filled with resentment? But then he thought about Victoria's face through the window, laughing at Ryan Caldwell's birthday party. He thought about the locked door, the changed locks, the 2 years of lies. And he realized Victoria hadn't been everything. She'd been the person he'd thought she was, the woman he'd married 12 years ago. But that woman had disappeared long before the government contract, long before the locked door. Maybe the question wasn't whether winning was worth losing, Victoria. Maybe the question was whether he'd really lost anything at all. 6 months after the divorce, Derek stood in Titan Tech's new headquarters, a gleaming tower in downtown San Francisco. The IPO had been the most successful tech offering in a decade. His personal wealth had grown to $18 billion. The quantum defense system was being installed in military installations across the country. He was on the cover of Forbes, Time, Wired, and he was alone. Not lonely, he'd realized. There was a difference. He had friends, colleagues, his mother who visited monthly. He dated occasionally. Women who were attracted to the success, to the money, to the power. It never went anywhere. He wasn't ready, might never be ready, but he was building something real. Titan Tech had hired 2,000 employees. They were developing quantum encryption for civilian use, creating technology that would protect privacy, secure communications, change how the world handled data. Derek went to work every day excited about the problems they were solving, the impact they were making. He'd also started a foundation, using $1 billion of his fortune to fund STEM education, to support young engineers and scientists, to ensure that kids who dreamed of building impossible things had the resources to try. He thought about his younger self sometimes, broke and stubborn, betting everything on a dream. He wanted to be the person who helped other dreamers, who believed when no one else did. Victoria had married Ryan Caldwell 3 months after the divorce was final. Derek saw the announcement on social media, Victoria in a white dress, Ryan beaming beside her. The comments were congratulatory, no mention of the scandal, as if the past had been erased. Derek felt nothing looking at the photo. No anger, no regret, no longing. Just a faint sadness for the people they'd been 12 years ago, before ambition and resentment had poisoned everything good. His phone rang, his CFO, Patricia Brennan. Derek, we just got approval for the European contract. Another $40 billion over 5 years. That's incredible, Tricia. We're changing the world, boss. You did it. You actually did it. Derek smiled. We did it. Titan Tech isn't me. It's all of us. After he hung up, Derek walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, Victoria was living her life with Ryan, probably in a house much like the one Derek had paid off for her. Somewhere out there were the people who doubted him, the investors who'd passed, the companies that had rejected his proposals. Somewhere out there was the version of himself that had stood in the rain, locked out and broken, watching his marriage end through a window. But that Derek was gone. In his place was someone harder, wiser, more careful with trust. Someone who understood that love and loyalty weren't guaranteed, that success could cost everything, that winning didn't always feel like victory. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Mitchell, the Secretary of Defense is here for your 3 o'clock." Derek straightened his tie, grabbed his tablet, and headed to the meeting. There was work to do, problems to solve, a future to build. He'd lost a marriage, lost the illusion of forever, lost the woman he'd thought was his partner. But he'd won himself back. He'd won his dream. He'd won the right to build something that mattered, to prove that the boy who'd believed in impossible things had been right all along. And in the end, that had to be enough, because it was all he had, and it was everything he'd ever wanted, except for the part where he'd wanted someone to share it with. But Derek was learning to live with that hollow space, was learning that some losses weren't recoverable, that some doors once locked stayed locked forever. He walked into the conference room, shook hands with the Secretary of Defense, and began the presentation that would shape the next phase of quantum defense. And if his mind wandered occasionally to a rain-soaked night, to a locked door, to a woman who'd chosen wrong, well, that was his burden to carry, his reminder of what ambition could cost. The meeting ended with another contract, another billion-dollar commitment, another victory. Derek smiled, accepted congratulations, and returned to his office as the sun set over San Francisco. His empire was built. His dream was real. His name would be in history books. And Victoria would spend the rest of her life knowing she'd walked away from all of it for a man with a trust fund and a Tesla, never understanding that Derek hadn't needed her belief to succeed. He just wanted it. That was the cruelest irony. She'd locked him out thinking he was nothing, and in doing so, had locked herself out of everything. Derek turned off his office lights and headed home to his penthouse apartment, to the stunning views and expensive furniture and absolute silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new contracts, new possibilities. Tonight, he would sit alone with his $18 billion and wonder if Victoria ever thought about the man she'd left standing in the rain, if she ever calculated the cost of that locked door, if she ever realized that the biggest mistake of her life had happened on the night Derek Mitchell won everything. The answer, Derek suspected, was yes, and that knowledge would have to be justice enough.